Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. It is less about the violence of history, and more about the stillness that surrounds it. The way footsteps echo on old stones, and how words whispered centuries ago still ripple faintly through time. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these forgotten mysteries can drift a little farther. Maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. The story begins not with kings or knights, but with whispers carried through churches, courts and markets. It was the 12th century, and Europe found itself stirred by voices that rose from pulpits and travelled across kingdoms. They spoke of Jerusalem, of a city that was sacred to so many, and of a struggle that had already been burning for decades. The Holy Land had shifted hands, and in the hearts of rulers and peasants alike, there grew a restless sense that something was unfinished. At the centre of these murmurings lay the idea of pilgrimage, journeys taken not for riches, but for the soul. Pilgrims had long walked to shrines scattered across Christendom, carrying their weariness as a form of devotion. Yet Jerusalem was not just another shrine. It was the place where Jesus had walked, where stories in Scripture seemed to step out of words and into stones. To be denied its pathways felt, to many, like a wound to faith itself. And when news spread that the city had fallen into the hands of Saladin, the ruler of a rising Islamic empire, the wound grew deeper, drawing the attention of both kings and commoners. Saladin was not a figure born of obscurity. His rise had already reshaped the East. With careful alliances, with patient strategy, and with the language of faith and duty, he had gathered together lands that had long been fractured. To his followers, he was not merely a commander, but a protector of Islam's holiest sites. His capture of Jerusalem in 1187 was not simply a military triumph. It was a statement to the world. Mosques stood firm where churches once claimed dominance, and the city that had been under Crusader control for nearly a century was once more under Muslim rule. The shock of that moment did not fade quickly. Word carried slowly, but when it reached Europe, it was sharpened into urgency. From Rome, Pope Gregory VIII issued a call, summoning Christendom to a new campaign, one greater and more fervent than those before. His words were not spoken softly. They were wrapped in promises of absolution, of eternal reward, and of honour that stretched beyond a single lifetime. The Third Crusade, as it would be remembered, was born out of this cry, a call not merely for warriors, but for the full weight of kingdoms to move eastward in defence of faith. Among the monarchs who heard this summons, none would be more remembered than Richard of England. Known already as Richard the Lionheart, his reputation was forged in the smoke and steel of earlier battles, long before the sands of Palestine would feel his presence. He was not a king known for patience, nor for the quiet life of governance. Even as heir, he had grown restless under the weight of expectation, preferring the clash of armies to the delicate dance of court politics. Where others hesitated, he leaned into the promise of battle. The call to Jerusalem was, for him, both a duty of faith and an arena in which his restless spirit might finally find purpose. But Richard was not alone in hearing it. Across France, Philip II, the young and calculating king, weighed the papal summons. He too knew the symbolic weight of Jerusalem, and though his heart leaned more toward the slow accumulation of power than the thrill of war, he could not ignore the pressure of both religion and reputation. To refuse would be to appear faithless. To accept would tie his name to a struggle larger than his crown. In the German lands, the mighty Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, seasoned by years of campaigns, also took up the cross. His presence lent an air of inevitability to the crusade, for here was a man whose very age and stature seemed to promise success. Yet the journey would prove unkind to him, reminding all who marched that ambition and mortality are uneasy companions. The call to holy war was not merely a royal matter. From villages in the English countryside to towns along the Rhine, men spoke of taking the cross. They stitched the red cloth emblem onto their garments, a sign not only of intent, but of identity. It marked them as part of a cause that transcended their small lives. Some went with hopes of salvation, some with hopes of adventure, and others with nothing left to lose but their burdens. For each, the journey eastward became a kind of pilgrimage, though one that carried swords alongside prayers. As the preparation swelled, so too did the quiet undercurrents of doubt. Families left behind wondered if they would ever see their fathers, sons, or brothers again. Lords who pledged themselves to the cause sometimes did so with hesitation, knowing the strain it would place on their lands. Yet in the rhythm of sermons and songs, the movement pressed forward. Richard himself embraced the role with a kind of ferocity. He arranged the financing, sometimes through harsh means, selling offices, demanding taxes, and treating the crusade as a venture that required not only devotion, but resources. His court buzzed with the language of outfitting ships, gathering supplies, and mustering men. In these preparations, his character emerged clearly, bold, decisive, and often ruthless. Where some kings balanced faith with politics, Richard leaned into the idea that Jerusalem was not merely a symbol, but a prize worth any cost. Far across the Mediterranean, Saladin also heard of this gathering storm. He was no stranger to the cycles of crusades, for the first and second had already left their marks upon the region. Yet he knew that this new wave would be different. The names of kings carried with them a weight greater than that of minor lords. To face Richard, Philip, and Frederick was not to face scattered armies, but the concentrated might of Europe. Still, Saladin did not tremble. His reputation had been built upon patience, upon an ability to draw enemies into struggles they could not easily win. He strengthened his garrisons, fortified his alliances, and prepared to meet the challenge not with fear, but with a kind of solemn readiness. In the East, the story was told differently. To Saladin's people, this was not a holy war to reclaim, but to defend. Jerusalem had been taken back into the embrace of Islam, and the thought of surrendering it once more was unthinkable. Where in Europe the call to arms was framed as rescue, in the Islamic world it was framed as protection. Both sides cloaked their cause in faith. Both drew upon scripture, and both believed the stones of Jerusalem carried eternal significance. As the months turned into years of preparation, Europe seemed to hold its breath. Fields that once echoed with harvest now echoed with the sound of recruits training. Ports filled with ships, their sails ready to catch the wind toward distant shores. The scale of the movement was unlike anything that had come before. Each step in these early stages was one more stitch binding together the fabric of the most epic rivalry of the Crusades. And yet, beneath the grandeur, the details of ordinary lives continued. Children grew up in the absence of fathers who had taken the cross. Merchants found opportunity in the sudden demand for supplies. Priests wrote letters urging perseverance. Life and war blended until the crusade was no longer just a campaign, but a rhythm that touched nearly every corner of Christendom. Richard, ever restless, pressed forward with determination. He knew his destiny would not be written in the quiet halls of Westminster, but in the shifting sands of the East. Saladin, far away, prepared for the coming tide. two leaders, separated by distance, yet bound by fate, were being drawn together by the same current, a call that began in sermons and spread like wildfire until it set kingdoms in motion. Thus the story begins, not with their meeting, nor with the clash of armies, but with the echo of words that stirred entire nations. A call to holy war, soft in its beginning, relentless in its spread, shaping the course of history in ways that neither Richard nor Saladin could yet fully know. The paths of two men, so different yet destined to intertwine, were being prepared. The rivalry that would define an age had its roots here, in the steady hum of voices that carried across lands, urging kings and peasants alike toward Jerusalem. The shores of Europe grew restless with the sound of movement. From harbours stretched along England's southern coast, ships were drawn into service, their timbers creaking under the weight of new purpose. The call to a holy war had spread across the land, but now it began to take form in sails, in anchors, in ropes coiled on docks, where fishermen once worked undisturbed. The quieter villages gave way to the clamour of men preparing for departure, and among them stood their king, Richard, newly crowned, restless, and ready to carve his destiny on foreign soil. Richard's coronation had come with both splendour and unease. He wore the crown of England, but his heart seemed already turned eastward. Unlike many monarchs who found themselves consumed with the management of law, of disputes, of endless petitions from nobles and towns, Richard appeared to treat kingship as a temporary mantle, useful only insofar as it gave him the authority to lead armies. He was a warrior before he was a ruler, and those who watched him could see that his gaze often drifted beyond the horizon, as though England were a stop along the way rather than his home. His preparations for the journey reflected this nature. He stripped his kingdom of resources with an efficiency that left no doubt of his determination. Offices were sold to the highest bidder, lands were mortgaged, and taxes pressed heavily upon those least able to resist. He was accused by some of treating the crown as little more than a purse to be emptied, but he seemed unconcerned. What mattered was not the grumbling of lords or the complaints of clerks, but the building of a force strong enough to make the long passage to the east. Ships became the lifeblood of this effort. Sturdy cogs and sleek galleys were gathered, fitted with provisions, and crowded with men who had pledged themselves to the cross. For many, it was their first time seeing the sea stretch beyond the edges of their world. To them it was vast and unknowable, a barrier and a promise, the shifting element that stood between their lives at home and the holy city they longed to reclaim. Richard did not prepare alone. Across the Channel, Philip of France was engaged in similar labours, though his methods bore the stamp of a different character. Where Richard was bold and restless, Philip was deliberate, calculating, wary of the costs. The two kings, bound by the same vow, carried into their partnership a rivalry of their own, born of ambition and sharpened by suspicion. Yet necessity pressed them together, for no single crown could bear the weight of the journey ahead. Their meeting at Vézelay in 1190 was a moment heavy with both ceremony and unease. Here, amid the throngs of knights and retainers, Richard and Philip agreed to set forth together, their armies held bound for the same cause. Yet beneath the words of brotherhood and faith, there lingered the knowledge that each sought glory for himself, and that the path to Jerusalem would not erase the jealousies of kings. For now, however, they stood united, their banners lifted side by side, their followers swelling with the hope that the combined might of England and France would prove irresistible. The departure did not come all at once. Armies moved like rivers, slow and winding, splitting into streams that converged only at the appointed shores. Richard led his men southward through France, a king marching not only with warriors, but with the weight of an entire kingdom's resources. The roads filled with dust, as columns of soldiers, supply wagons, and horses pressed toward the sea. Villagers lined the ways to watch them pass, offering food, water, or simply their gaze, as though witnessing history itself step across their thresholds. When at last the fleet gathered, the scene was unlike anything the coasts of Europe had known. Hundreds of ships crowded the waters, their sails straining in the wind, their decks heavy with men, animals, and supplies. It was not the voyage of a single expedition, but of a nation uprooted and set adrift. The sea became a highway, its expanse carrying hopes and fears alike toward the unknown. The rhythm of departure was not swift. Weather, provisions, and the needs of so many men slowed the pace. The fleet made its way in stages, hugging coasts, seeking harbours, finding moments of rest before venturing onward. Each stop was a reminder that the crusade was as much endurance as it was zeal. The Mediterranean, glittering under the sun, was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure, its calm waters capable of turning violent without warning. At Messina in Sicily, the crusading kings paused, their armies encamped in foreign lands while waiting for favourable winds. It was here that the strain between Richard and Philip began to show more plainly. The alliance, necessary though it was, could not smooth over the differences of temperament and ambition. Richard's boldness sometimes seemed to Philip little more than recklessness, while Philip's caution appeared to Richard as hesitation. The city of Messina itself became a stage for these tensions, as disputes over supplies, lodgings, and the conduct of men ignited quarrels that reminded both kings how fragile unity could be. Yet amid these frictions, Richard revealed another side of himself, one that stirred both admiration and unease. He moved through the camps with confidence, speaking to his men, sharing in their hardships, and binding them not only with authority, but with presence. His charisma was undeniable, a force that seemed to draw loyalty out of those around him. Even in the delays and discomforts of the Sicilian stay, his followers remained steadfast, convinced that under Richard's banner they would see the holy city reclaimed. The sea waited, patient and unyielding. When at last the fleet set forth again, sails unfurled like wings across the horizon. It was as though an entire kingdom had lifted itself into motion. The journey carried them further into lands where the customs and languages shifted, where the shores looked unfamiliar, and where every harbour reminded them how far they had travelled from the damp fields of home. For Richard, the voyage was more than a passage of water. It was a crossing from the life of a European monarch into the role he seemed born to play, that of a warrior king in a struggle that spanned faith, empire, and destiny. Each day at sea carried him closer to Saladin, though the two had never met, their names already intertwined in the minds of both followers and enemies. Storms struck, scattering ships, sending men clinging to planks and praying as waves rose higher than masts. The sea claimed lives with the same indifference it showed to kings and commoners alike. When vessels broke apart on unfamiliar coasts, survivors crawled ashore, their pilgrimage nearly ended before it had begun. Yet still the fleet pressed onward, driven by the same fire that had carried them from England's shores. The Mediterranean was more than a route. It was a trial. It tested endurance, faith, and the fragile unity of allies. Each port touched, each island glimpsed, was a reminder that the path to Jerusalem was long, winding, and fraught with obstacles that did not carry the clash of swords, but the weariness of distance. Yet through it all, the figure of Richard loomed large, his resolve unbroken, his eyes fixed always eastward. By the time the fleet neared Cyprus, the crusade had already begun to carve its shape. Men who had set out filled with zeal now carried the marks of hardship. Provisions dwindled, tempers flared, and the sheer weight of so many souls pressed against the fragile structures of order. But Richard thrived in such conditions. Where others saw only difficulty, he found opportunity, seizing upon every moment to display his strength, to reinforce his command, to bind his followers closer through the certainty of his presence. Thus the crowned king did not merely sail toward the Holy Land, he transformed the voyage itself into a theatre of his power. The sea, indifferent though it was, became the stage on which Richard's legend grew, carrying with it the whispers that reached even the ears of Saladin. For across the waters, in lands of heat and dust, the Sultan too was preparing, aware that a force unlike any before was moving steadily toward him. And so the sails carried them onward, eastward, the horizon always ahead, the wind filling cloth that snapped like banners of destiny. What had begun as a call in distant churches now took the form of ships upon the water, kings upon their decks, and armies that spanned nations. Richard's journey was not yet at its end, but already it had transformed him, shaping the rivalry that would soon define both him and Saladin. The sea stretched outward like an endless mirror, reflecting the sky in shades of blue that shifted with the passing of each day. Beneath the sails of Richard's fleet, the Mediterranean opened itself as both pathway and trial, carrying thousands of men toward the east. The journey was not swift. It was measured in slow rhythms, the creak of wooden hulls, the slap of water against planks, the flapping of canvas pulled taut by the wind. Life aboard these ships became its own world. Far removed from the lands they had left behind, the Mediterranean was no stranger to great movements of people. For centuries it had borne the weight of trade, of armies, of pilgrimages. Now it carried the Crusaders, a floating kingdom on the move. Men who had never seen beyond their villages found themselves staring at horizons where sea and sky touched, with no land in sight for days. To them it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a vastness that dwarfed their small lives. Some whispered prayers to calm their fears, while others sang songs to chase away the monotony. The sea, indifferent to their voices, carried them all the same. Storms broke the stillness without warning. Dark clouds gathered, winds howled, and waves rose higher than masts. Ships groaned under the strain, their decks awash with salt water. Men clung to ropes and timbers as, shouting over the roar of the sea. To those unaccustomed to such fury, it felt as though the very elements were testing their resolve. Lives were lost in these tempests, swallowed by the deep, with no grave but the ocean floor. Yet even as the storm scattered vessels and claimed souls, the fleet endured, driven always onward by the relentless will of its king. Richard moved among his men with a presence that steadied them. He was not merely a distant figure on a throne, but a commander who shared the dangers of the voyage. His confidence was like a beacon, a reminder that the hardships of the sea were but a passage towards something greater. Stories of his courage spread from deck to deck, carried in whispers and retold around the meagre fires lit in sheltered corners of the ships. For those who followed him, Richard was more than a king. He was the embodiment of their cause. The fleet pressed southward, seeking safe harbours where supplies could be replenished and men could find brief rest. One such harbour lay in the island of Cyprus, a place of fertile lands and strategic value. But what might have been a simple stopover soon became another stage in Richard's unfolding legend. Cyprus was under the rule of Isaac Komnenos, a man who had seized the island for himself and declared independence from Byzantium. His rule was harsh, and his pride ill-suited to the sudden arrival of the Crusaders. When shipwrecked vessels from Richard's fleet washed upon Cypriot shores, their survivors were taken captive, their goods seized. It was an affront that Richard could not ignore. What followed was swift and decisive. Richard landed with his men and turned the island into a battlefield. Isaac's forces, though numerous, were no match for the discipline and ferocity of the Crusaders under their king. Skirmishes spread across the island, villages and strongholds falling in rapid succession. Richard's reputation as a warrior found new ground here, not in the deserts of Palestine, but in the green hills and valleys of Cyprus. Within weeks, Isaac's defiance crumbled, and the island bent to the will of the Crusaders. For Richard, Cyprus was more than a conquest. It became a vital base of operations, a storehouse of supplies, and a staging ground for the next leg of the journey. Its capture also sent a message across the sea. The King of England was not a man to be slighted, and his presence could alter the fate of kingdoms. To his followers, the victory was proof that divine favour rested upon their cause. To his enemies, it was a warning that the lion-hearted king carried claws sharp enough to tear through obstacles with alarming speed. The capture of Cyprus also brought another thread into Richard's story. While on the island, he wed Berengaria of Navarre. A marriage arranged to strengthen alliances, but also symbolic of his stature. The wedding was a moment of celebration amid the hardships of the crusade, a brief interlude of festivity before the march toward war resumed. For the men who followed him, it was a reminder that even kings bore personal ties and obligations, though Richard himself seemed always more wedded to his sword than to any earthly bond. As the fleet once again set sail, leaving Cyprus under the watch of his allies, Richard carried with him not only supplies and victories, but the growing weight of expectation. Every step of the journey added to his legend, and every action drew him closer to the rival who awaited across the waters. The Mediterranean stretched onward, its vastness reminding all aboard the fleet of the distance yet to be covered. The monotony of days at sea returned, broken only by the routines of sailors and the prayers of soldiers. Food grew stale, water brackish, tempers short. Yet in the face of such discomfort, the cause that bound them remained unshaken. The thought of Jerusalem, distant and shining in their imagination, gave purpose to their endurance. Far away, Saladin watched these developments with keen attention. News travelled slowly across the sea, carried by merchants, envoys, and stands, but each fragment painted a clearer picture. He knew of Richard's capture of Cyprus, of the growing might of the crusading fleet, and of the determination that fueled it. For Saladin, the Mediterranean was not merely water, it was a veil behind which a storm gathered, a storm that would soon break upon his lands. Saladin's preparations mirrored Richard's in their intensity, though they bore a different character. Where Richard's strength lay in bold action, Saladin's lay in patience and calculation. He fortified cities, rallied his emirs, and ensured that his forces were ready not just for battle, but for endurance. He knew that the struggle ahead would not be decided in a single clash, but in a long contest of strength, faith, and resolve. The two leaders, separated by sea and circumstance, seemed to draw closer with each passing day. Their names began to circle one another like twin stars in the heavens, destined to meet though still apart. For the men who followed them, the rivalry was already alive, carried in songs, stories, and prayers. Richard, the lion-hearted king from the west, and Saladin, the sultan who had reclaimed Jerusalem, stood as opposites across the Mediterranean's expanse, their fates bound by forces larger than themselves. The sea bore them onward, past islands that rose like stepping stones, past coasts that slipped away into the distance, past storms and calms alike. Each mile crossed was a thread woven into a tapestry that stretched from Europe to the Levant, from the courts of kings to the tents of soldiers. The Mediterranean, with its endless horizon, became the stage upon which the next act of history was set to unfold. and still the ships moved, sails full of wind, timbers straining, men gazing eastward. What began as a call in distant lands had become a fleet upon the waters, and what was once only rumour to Saladin was now a reality drawing nearer with every tide. The rivalry that would define an age pressed steadily toward its centre, carried by the currents of the blue Mediterranean. In the east, where the sun rose over deserts and the call to prayer carried across the domes of cities, another figure stood at the centre of unfolding history. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, waited in the lands he had gathered under his banner. The Mediterranean carried whispers of the fleets that moved toward him, but he did not rush to meet them. His strength was not in haste, but in patience, in the quiet certainty that time itself could be wielded as a weapon. The capture of Jerusalem had sealed his place in the eyes of his people. In 1187, when his banners rose above the holy city, it was more than a conquest. It was a triumph that bound together faith, politics, and destiny. To Muslims across the region, Saladin became the defender of Islam's sacred places, the one who had restored what had been lost for nearly a century. His reputation spread beyond his empire, reaching even the ears of Europe, where his name was spoken with both fear and respect. Now, as news reached him of Richard's approach, he understood that the struggle for Jerusalem was far from over. Saladin was not a man born into kingship. His rise had been shaped by service, by loyalty to stronger figures before him, and by his ability to step into power when the moment presented itself. He learnt the art of war in the service of Nur ad-Din, watching the delicate balance of politics and faith that defined the Muslim world in the age of the Crusades. Where others might have sought only conquest, Saladin sought unity. The Muslim lands were fractured when he began his climb, split by rival dynasties, tribes, and interests. His genius lay not only in the sword, but in the way he wove these fragments into a single fabric, binding Egypt and Syria together under his rule. That unity was tested constantly, for emirs and princes did not always bend easily to his authority. Yet Saladin possessed a gift for patience, for winning loyalty through generosity as much as through strength. He rewarded allies, forgave rivals when it suited him, and maintained a vision larger than the ambitions of any single emir. The holy city was his lodestar, and through it he convinced others to set aside disputes in service of a greater cause. It was this vision that now sustained him as he prepared for the arrival of the crusading kings. He did not need to match their fleets with ships of his own. The sea belonged to them. Instead, he watched the land, fortifying strongholds, securing supplies, and ensuring that his armies could endure the long struggle that was sure to follow. For Saladin knew that wars of faith were never quick. They were tests of endurance, of spirit, of the will to outlast the enemy, even when the tide seemed to turn against you. His court in Cairo and Damascus was a place of both solemnity and activity. Advisors spoke of the Crusaders' numbers, of their leaders' reputations, of the wealth they carried with them. Saladin listened carefully, weighing each report, but he did not allow anxiety to cloud his judgment. He knew that Richard was no ordinary king, that his presence would bring with it both strength and danger. But Saladin also understood that Richard was a man of flesh and blood, subject to the same weariness, the same limits of supply and morale, that burdened all armies who ventured far from home. In his waiting, Saladin relied not only on armies, but on faith. The rhythm of prayer shaped his days, grounding him in the belief that his cause was righteous, and that God's will would guide the outcome. This was not the fanatical zeal that his enemies imagined, but a steady devotion, a trust that allowed him to bear the weight of responsibility without faltering. To those around him, Saladin seemed a man who embodied both humility and authority, a paradox that deepened his influence. He was a ruler who slept on simple mats, who ate sparingly, and who gave generously. His followers loved him not only for his victories, but for the way he lived among them. As the crusading fleet approached the shores of the Levant, Saladin's shadow stretched across the land. In Acre, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem itself, his presence was felt even when he was not physically there. Garrison commanders strengthened their walls, soldiers drilled in the courtyards of fortresses, and the people prepared themselves for siege and hardship. They trusted that their sultan would not abandon them, that his patience and wisdom would see them through. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin was not yet face to face, yet already it took shape in the imagination of their followers. Richard's men sang of the Lionheart, the fearless king who would carve a path to Jerusalem. Saladin's people spoke of their sultan as the shield of Islam, the one who had humbled crusaders before and would do so again. In this way, even before their swords crossed, the two men were bound together, their reputations sharpening one another like steel against flint. But Saladin was no stranger to the weight of legend. He knew that stories could embolden soldiers, yet he also knew that legends did not win wars without careful planning. His strategies were shaped by the geography of the land, by the supply routes that sustained armies, and by the seasons that governed both agriculture and war. He sought to deny the Crusaders easy victories, to stretch their resources, to remind them that the land itself could be an adversary as formidable as any army. Saladin's patience was not passivity. When opportunity presented itself, he could strike with speed and precision. His cavalry, swift and disciplined, could appear suddenly, harassing enemy columns, cutting off supplies, forcing them into battles of his choosing. He understood that Richard's strength lay in direct confrontation, in the clash of armoured knights. To meet him head-on without preparation would be folly. Instead, Saladin prepared to fight a different kind of war, one of manoeuvre, attrition, and the careful application of pressure. Even as he waited, Saladin's reputation in the West grew in unexpected ways. Tales of his mercy at Jerusalem, when he had spared the lives of the city's inhabitants rather than putting them to the sword, reached Europe and stirred admiration even among his enemies. Chroniclers spoke of him as both formidable and honourable, a man who could be ruthless in battle, yet generous in victory. This image set him apart from the caricatures of a cruel infidel that earlier crusaders had painted. It gave their rivalry a strange symmetry. Richard, the fearless Christian king, and Saladin, the noble Muslim sultan, each admired even by those who opposed them. In the quiet moments of his court, Saladin considered the nature of his adversary. He understood that Richard was no ordinary monarch, that his hunger for glory would drive him to great risks. But Saladin also knew the burdens of distance, that armies so far from home could not remain forever, that supplies could falter, that divisions between allies might grow. In these cracks, he sought his advantage, waiting for the moment when patience would outweigh fury. The land itself seemed to join in his vigil. The deserts stretched outward, vast and unyielding, ready to test the endurance of any army that dared march through them. The heat pressed down like a weight, draining strength from men and beasts alike. The rivers and wells, scattered and precious, became lifelines that could determine the fate of thousands. Saladin knew this terrain intimately, and he trusted that it would serve him as faithfully as his soldiers. While the Mediterranean bore Richard ever closer, Saladin stood in his waiting shadow, a figure both calm and vigilant. He did not rush to meet the Crusaders at sea. Instead, he prepared the ground upon which they would eventually step. His was not the impatience of a warrior eager for battle, but the steadiness of a ruler who understood that history was not written in a single stroke, but in the long unfolding of events. And so the East prepared itself, quietly, steadily, under the watchful eye of its sultan. His shadow stretched not only over fortresses and battlefields, but over the imaginations of those who followed him and those who opposed him. Richard drew nearer with each tide, his sails catching the wind that carried him across the Mediterranean. Saladin, waiting with the patience of stone and the vision of one who knew the land as his own, readied himself for the meeting that would shape the age. The sea had carried the crusading host to the shores of the Levant, and before them rose the stubborn walls of Acre. What had once been a thriving port of trade now became the still heart of a struggle that seemed endless. Ships crowded the waters, their masts forming a forest of wood above the waves, while tents stretched across the plain, pale shapes fluttering in the coastal wind. The clash between Richard and Saladin did not yet take the form of a single great battle. Instead, it settled into the grinding rhythm of a siege, a contest of endurance that tested the patience of both sides. The city itself stood as if balanced between worlds. Its high walls, repaired and strengthened, looked out upon armies that never dispersed. Within them, defenders clung to their duty, supplied by narrow lifelines through the sea. Without, the armies of Christendom encircled the city like an iron band, while Saladin's forces pressed close enough to threaten them from behind. No one could leave without fear. No one could advance without danger. And so time itself became the true battlefield, each day eroding strength, each night offering only a brief reprieve before the struggle began again. The crusading camp was unlike anything Acre had seen before. Soldiers from distant kingdoms mingled uneasily, their banners fluttering in the same salt wind, though their tongues and tempers were often at odds. French knights argued with Germans, Italians whispered of profits to be made, and the English waited for their king, whose presence still lay upon the horizon. Rivalries did not disappear in the face of common purpose. Yet hunger and disease made all men equal, creeping through the crowded tents with a hand more merciless than any enemy sword. The defenders within Acre fared little better. Supplies dwindled as months dragged into years. The walls that shielded them also imprisoned them, cutting them off from relief, except when Saladin's fleet could slip past the cordon of Crusader ships. Food grew scarce, disease took hold, and yet the city held on. Each sunrise revealed the same scene: watchmen on the towers, siege engines groaning into motion, arrows arcing across the air, and the weary persistence of two sides locked together by fate. For Saladin, Acre became both burden and symbol. He could not allow the city to fall, for its loss would open the coast to the Crusaders. Yet to relieve it fully required battles that risked his own strength. Again and again, his forces swept close, striking at the besiegers, seeking to cut off their supplies, to scatter their resolve. But the Crusaders endured, rebuilding their lines, driving stakes into the earth, erecting palisades that turned their camps into fortresses of their own. Neither side could deal a decisive blow, and so the stalemate stretched on, an unyielding knot of willpower. When Richard at last arrived, his presence breathed new determination into the weary camp. His ships brought not only soldiers, but also engines of war, towering constructions of timber that rolled across the earth like moving fortresses. Catapults hurled stones that shook the very foundations of Acre's walls. Battering rams, covered in hides to resist fire, pounded ceaselessly at the gates. Where others had grown listless, Richard threw himself into the work with the vigour of a man who believed destiny itself was watching. Yet even with his energy, the siege did not yield quickly. The defenders answered every new assault with resilience of their own. Fires consumed towers, arrows felled engineers, and sudden sorties struck at the besiegers when they least expected. For every breach opened, another wall of resistance rose to meet it. The struggle was not of days or weeks, but of seasons, each turn of the year layering hardship upon both sides. Disease gnawed at the Crusader ranks. The heat of the Levant summer withered men who had come from colder lands. The winter rains turned the fields into mud, fouling food and water, spreading sickness. Corpses lay where they fell, too many to bury properly. And still the camp endured, driven less by hope of quick victory than by the knowledge that retreat would mean ruin. Inside Acre, the suffering mirrored that of the besiegers. Food ran so short that animals once prized for their strength were slaughtered for meat. Water grew foul. Families huddled in fear, praying that relief would come, yet knowing that their city stood on the knife edge of survival. Some whispered of surrender, others swore to hold until the last. But always, over the horizon, they looked for Saladin's banners, hoping that their sultan would not abandon them. And Saladin did not abandon them. Again and again, he swept near the Crusader lines, his cavalry flashing like dark waves against the edges of the encampment. His armies carried provisions. His presence kept alive the spirit of resistance. He harassed the besiegers, cut at their foraging parties, struck suddenly, and vanished back into the hills. To the Crusaders, his shadow was a constant pressure, a reminder that even as they tightened the noose around Acre, they themselves were not free from danger. Yet Saladin, for all his strength, knew the limits of his position. He could not break the Crusader lines outright, without risking a catastrophe. His forces could wound, but they could not crush. The stalemate stretched further, each side straining yet refusing to break. For Richard and Saladin both, the siege became a test of character as much as of arms. Time blurred, days folding into weeks, weeks into months. The siege seemed to consume all else, a slow devouring that neither king could escape. And in that grinding test, both leaders revealed their nature. Richard, bold and relentless, hurled his strength again and again at the city, never satisfied until the walls themselves groaned under the weight of his engines. Saladin, patient and watchful, refused to be drawn into rashness, content to wait for the strain of time to wear down his enemies. Between them, Acre endured, a city caught in the crucible of their rivalry. When at last the defenders, gaunt and desperate, raised their plea for terms, it was less a triumph than an exhaustion. Years of struggle had reduced the proud city to near ruin. Richard and his allies claimed victory, but the price had been staggering. Men had been lost not only to battle, but to hunger, disease and despair. The banners that rose above Acre's walls marked a turning, but not an ending. For Saladin still lived, his armies still stood, and Jerusalem still lay beyond the horizon. The siege had not broken either king. Instead, it had forged their rivalry more deeply, binding their names together in endurance. Neither man would yield easily, neither man would accept that the other had prevailed. And so, as Acre passed from one hand to another, the struggle did not diminish. It stretched onward, the shadow of Saladin waiting still, the fire of Richard burning just as fiercely. In the stillness after Acre's fall, one could hear the silence of exhaustion. The city stood battered, its walls scarred by countless stones, its people diminished, its streets filled with the echoes of all that had been endured. But that silence was not peace. It was only the pause between storms, the quiet breath before the rivalry moved onward, deeper into the heart of the land that had become the stage for their unyielding contest. The walls of Acre no longer stood between the rivals. The banners of the Crusaders hung from its towers, though the air still carried the smell of smoke and the quiet sorrow of a city that had been wrung nearly dry. But beyond the shattered gates, the horizon stretched wide, an open expanse of plains and hills where the struggle could no longer hide behind walls of stone. It was there, beneath the unrelenting sun, that Richard and Saladin began to test each other in the kind of war that demanded speed, cunning, and the patience to endure. The land itself seemed to take sides in the contest. The earth was hard, cracked by the weight of countless hooves. The wind carried dust that clung to skin and armour alike, turning men into pale figures, as if sculpted from the very soil they trod upon. Each step forward toward Jerusalem meant stretching supply lines thinner, each march across the plain inviting ambush from swift riders who knew the ground as intimately as they knew the lines of their own hands. Richard's army moved like a slow tide, deliberate and unyielding. Knights in mail, foot soldiers with shields, crossbowmen with their cords drawn taut, all advanced beneath the lion banner that fluttered in the heat. They were trained for shock, for the moment when steel met steel in a decisive clash. But on the open plains, battle rarely arrived as expected. Instead, it came in flurries of dust, sudden strikes of horsemen who appeared as if from nowhere, loosing arrows that darkened the sky before vanishing again into the haze. Saladin's forces thrived in that rhythm. His cavalry swept over the ground with a grace that bewildered those who tried to follow. They rode lightly, their bows strung, their quivers filled, their movements fluid as the desert wind itself. Where Richard's men carried the weight of armour, Saladin's men carried the weight of the land's memory. They struck not to end the fight in one blow, but to wear down, to weaken, to let hunger and fatigue finish what arrows began. The clash between these two ways of war unfolded with a strange beauty. One side pressed forward with shields locked, daring the storm to break upon them. The other circled, probed, and faded back, always just beyond the reach of the charge. For days at a time, the struggle resembled not a single great battle, but an unending dance. A test of who could hold out longer beneath the weight of sun, thirst, and the dust that never ceased to rise from the earth. Richard understood the danger of chasing shadows. To break formation was to invite disaster, and so he drilled his men to hold steady even when the rain of arrows grew unbearable. Knights longed to spur their horses into pursuit, yet he reined them in, knowing that impatience would scatter his strength into the waiting jaws of Saladin's riders. Columns advanced in measured steps, shields raised overhead when arrows hissed downward, crossbows loosing bolts in steady rhythm when riders came too near. Progress was slow, but it was progress all the same. Saladin, watching from a distance, recognized the discipline of his rival. He had seen many armies falter under the same tactics, breaking apart as thirst and fear set in. Yet Richard's lines held, as stubborn as the man himself. And so the contest deepened. The Sultan tested them again and again, each strike designed to probe for weakness. Camps were harried, foragers cut down, water sources seized. The open plains became not only a battlefield, but a vast chessboard, each move shaping the survival of thousands. For the men who lived through it, the days blurred into one another. The clang of armour, the thrum of bowstrings, the calls of commanders all merged into a weary rhythm. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the knowledge that at any moment the alarm could sound. Food grew scarcer with every mile pressed inland, and water more precious than gold. To stumble across a stream was a blessing, to lose it to enemy riders was despair. Richard himself rode at the heart of his men, a figure as relentless as the march. His presence steadied them, for he seemed carved from the same iron as their resolve. He bore the weight of armour and heat with the same stubbornness he showed before Acre's walls, always moving, always pressing forward. To his men, he was the lion not only in name, but in bearing, unyielding in the face of adversity. Across the plains, Saladin remained a presence felt as much as seen. His horsemen could vanish behind a rise of land, only to reappear in force miles away. His banners rose and fell like waves, never letting the Crusaders rest. To his men, he was the guiding hand that turned chaos into strategy, who taught patience where others might rush to destruction. His calm in the face of Richard's advance gave them strength, for they believed time itself would wear their enemies down. There were moments when the slow grind erupted into sudden fury. Lines met, shields shattered, and the open plains rang with the crash of steel. Horses screamed, men fell, and the air thickened with the acrid smell of sweat and blood. Yet even these clashes rarely ended decisively. One side would press forward, the other would withdraw, and once more the dust would settle into uneasy stillness. For those who marched in the heat, the rivalry between king and sultan became less an abstract tale and more the measure of their daily survival. Richard's determination was the reason they kept moving despite exhaustion. Saladin's pressure was the reason they never felt secure, even in moments of calm. Every skirmish, every weary mile, carried with it the echo of their contest, as though the plains themselves were stage and witness to their duel. And yet, within that endless rhythm, there were glimpses of something greater than mere hostility. At times when the fighting lulled, envoys moved between the camps, carrying words instead of weapons. Offers of exchange, discussions of prisoners, and even suggestions of truce crossed the dusty ground. In those brief moments, the rivalry revealed itself as one of respect as well as enmity, for neither king could deny the strength of the other. The open plains stretched on, each horizon yielding another horizon beyond it. Dust clung to armour, steel grew dull from constant use, and men counted not victories, but days endured. The struggle was not a single battle, but a series of trials, each designed to sap the will of the other. And still, both leaders held firm, their rivalry deepening with every test. By the time the Crusaders drew nearer to the heartland where Jerusalem lay, the plains behind them had become a graveyard of effort, marked not by monuments, but by the quiet memory of dust and steel. Those who had marched there carried the experience upon their faces, in the hollows of their eyes, in the scars etched upon their bodies. They had lived within the rivalry of Richard and Saladin, had walked through the crucible of endurance, and knew that the contest was far from over. The sun sank low upon the horizon, casting long shadows across the earth. Camps settled into uneasy quiet, the faint glow of fires flickering against the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a rider might still appear, a reminder that the struggle had no true boundaries, no walls to contain it. The plains stretched endlessly, as if to remind both king and sultan that their rivalry belonged not only to them, but to the land itself, which bore the imprint of every hoof, every step, every clash of steel. And so the dust lingered, and the steel remained drawn, as the story pressed forward toward the holy city that both men held in their gaze. The march inland carried not only the clash of swords and the dust of hooves, but also the quieter burdens that weighed upon every soul who walked the contested earth. Beneath the outward struggle of two great leaders, there stirred something deeper, more fragile, and harder to command. The restlessness of belief, the shadows of doubt, and the uneasy voices of faith and fear that travelled with the armies like unseen companions. The land itself seemed to draw those feelings to the surface. To the Crusaders, every mile covered was heavy with sacred memory. The roads they trudged were not mere paths of earth, but imagined arteries that ran toward the heart of their faith. Yet with each weary step, the holy city that had stirred them from distant homes seemed no closer, its promise obscured by hunger, fatigue, and the endless manoeuvres of Saladin's riders. Pilgrims who had once dreamed of kneeling in Jerusalem's churches now found themselves staggering beneath the sun, clutching at hope as if it were as fragile as the skin of their canteens. Richard's men looked to him not only as a commander, but as the figure who must make sense of their suffering. His presence reassured them, yet even the Lionheart could not silence the murmurs that drifted through the campfires at night. Some whispered that God tested them, that their wounds and hunger were purifying flames meant to prove their devotion. Others muttered with unease, wondering why the Almighty had not already handed them victory if their cause was righteous. Faith was a drumbeat in the Crusader host, but fear was its echo. Every arrow that fell from the sky carried not just the threat of death, but the question of divine favour. Priests moved among the tents, lifting weary faces with hymns and blessings, but even their voices sometimes trembled beneath the weight of doubt. Men confessed their sins with urgency, as though uncertain whether the next dawn would rise upon them. And yet, for all the cracks that showed, they still followed Richard, still pressed onward, still clung to the belief that their suffering had meaning. On the other side of the plains, Saladin's men bore their own burdens of spirit. To them, the struggle was no less sacred. The defence of their land, their people, and their faith was a duty tied to their very sense of existence. The Sultan's presence was more than strategic, it was spiritual. His calm in the face of Richard's relentless advance reminded them that the struggle was not measured only by the tally of battles, but by the endurance of belief. But even within Saladin's camp, shadows of fear sometimes lengthened. The Crusaders were formidable, their discipline unlike that of armies who had come before. Each clash with them showed that these were no ordinary invaders, but men driven by a fire as fierce as their own. At night, around low fires, some asked if victory was possible against an enemy who refused to break. Others prayed that their faith would not falter, for to falter was to invite ruin. Saladin, ever measured, offered reassurance without false promise. He reminded his men that time and patience were allies, that the land itself stood with them. He spoke not of triumph snatched in a single blow, but of the strength found in endurance. His words carried the weight of a man who understood that war was as much about the spirit as it was about the sword. To his soldiers, that steadiness was itself a kind of faith, one that gave courage in moments when fear whispered most loudly. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin deepened in this unseen realm as well. Neither king commanded only armies, each commanded belief. Their men looked to them not just for orders, but for signs that their cause was just, that their suffering had a purpose. Every gesture, every decision was measured against that expectation. A victory in battle lifted spirits as much as it secured ground, while a setback threatened to unravel the fragile fabric of faith. In this contest of belief, even silence carried meaning. When Richard's columns marched under the blazing sun, shields lifted against the rain of arrows. Their grim persistence spoke of a faith beyond words. When Saladin's cavalry swept in and withdrew, never breaking, never tiring, their patience proclaimed its own devotion. Each side became a mirror for the other, reflecting not only strength, but also the quiet, unspoken fears that lay beneath. For the common soldier, the echoes of faith and fear often blurred together. To endure hunger and thirst was to test the limits of belief. To watch comrades fall to illness was to wonder why heaven allowed such suffering. Yet those same moments also drew out acts of devotion so small and tender that they seemed invisible beside the thunder of war. A man sharing his last crust of bread, another offering water to the wounded, a whispered prayer before sleep, each carried a weight that held the armies together more firmly than chains. The nights were often the hardest. The plains grew quiet under the stars, the wind cooling the dust that lingered over the earth. In that stillness, the mind grew restless. Men dreamed of home, of families left behind, of a peace that seemed impossibly distant. The holy city felt both near and possibly far, a vision that flickered like a lantern in the dark. Some clung to that light with fierce determination. Others feared it might vanish entirely. Richard himself was not untouched by such shadows. Though outwardly unyielding, he too bore the weight of responsibility that no crown could lighten. To falter in leadership would mean not only defeat in battle, but also the collapse of belief among his men. His prayers in the quiet hours were as intense as his charges on the battlefield, for he knew that his rival across the plains was not only a warrior of flesh and blood, but also a symbol of faith to his people. Saladin, in his own silence, carried a burden equally heavy. He was the shield of his world, the figure upon whom countless lives depended. He could not allow despair to take root, for despair was more dangerous than any crusader blade. His calm was deliberate, a chosen mantle, for he knew that fear was contagious, spreading like smoke through an army if left unchecked. And so he bore it within himself, never showing the weight even when it pressed heavily upon him. As the campaign pressed onward, these echoes of faith and fear became as much a part of the war as the sound of arrows and swords. They moved invisibly through the ranks, shaping the will of men, guiding choices, sustaining endurance. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin unfolded not only in the clash of their strategies, but also in the hearts of those who followed them. And so, amid the dust and steel of the open plains, there lingered another battle, quieter, less visible, but no less decisive. It was the struggle to believe, to resist despair, to find meaning in the endless hardship. In that unseen contest, both armies reflected the same truth, that even the most epic rivalry of kings was carried forward on the fragile shoulders of faith, and shadowed always by the murmur of fear. The march did not end, the struggle did not cease, but through it all the echoes remained, resonant, insistent, reminding each man that he carried within himself the same conflict that raged upon the earth. The days pressed onward, and with them the weary procession of men and beasts stretched across the heated plains, moving as if the very earth itself tested the patience of both armies. The clash of faith and fear that lingered among the soldiers had not broken them. Instead, it had hardened their steps, and still the rivalry of two kings gave shape to every march. Amid that slow passage of time, one figure seemed to cut most clearly through the haze of dust and exhaustion, and that was Richard himself, the Lionheart, whose very presence became as much a symbol as the banners that fluttered above the host. When the sun rose, gilding the horizon in molten light, his banner often caught the wind before all others. A cross of crimson upon white, bold against the pale sky. It seemed to move with a life of its own, a reminder to the Crusaders that their king was among them, unbowed, untiring. The sight of it raised weary men from their stupor. Even when their mouths were dry with thirst and their bellies hollow, that banner told them they had not been abandoned. The Lionheart rode beneath it, steady and unyielding, as though carved out of the very will they needed to survive. It was not only the Crusaders who watched the banner. Across the dunes, Saladin's men saw it too, a white flame against the golden air. They whispered of it, some with dread, others with respect, for they knew that where that banner stood, their enemy was at his strongest. It became more than cloth in the wind. It was a mark of defiance, of resolve, of a king who refused to vanish from the land he sought to claim. Richard's presence upon the field was unlike that of many rulers. He was no distant figure. hidden behind walls of bodyguards or draped in ceremony. Instead, he rode among his men, visible, almost tangible, his armour gleaming beneath the desert sun. He carried himself with a kind of restless energy, always seeking the front, always refusing to let the weight of command turn him into a shadow. The men saw him ride, saw him lift his sword, saw him endure the same heat that burned them, and in that shared struggle, their strength deepened. The wind itself seemed to conspire with him. When it rose across the open ground, carrying the grit of sand and dust, his banner still held firm, its fabric snapping with defiance. It was as though the desert tested the endurance of the Lionheart and found him unwilling to bow. The sound of it, cloth cracking sharply in the wind, became a rhythm that accompanied the march, a sound as steady as a drum, telling the weary that their king did not falter. Yet Richard's strength was not only in what his men saw, it was in the way he carried himself when shadows pressed in. In councils, he spoke with clarity and confidence, even when the choices before him were weighed with risk. He gave no room for despair, no hint of hesitation. To doubt, even silently, was to weaken the bond that held his host together. And so he bore his own weariness as a private burden, hidden beneath the unshakable image of a king who thrived in the desert's unforgiving air. Saladin watched this with measured eyes. He understood the power of symbols as well as Richard did. He knew that armies did not move by swords alone, but by what they believed in, by the figures they followed, by the images that seemed larger than life. To strike at Richard's banner was to strike at the heart of the Crusader host, but Saladin was patient. He did not waste himself in reckless charges against the Lionheart's strength. He circled, he waited, he tested, like the desert wind itself, knowing that even stone is worn down with time. And so the rivalry deepened, not in the quick flash of a single moment, but in the slow dance of endurance. Richard pressed forward, carrying his banner like a declaration carved into the scarpe. Saladin shadowed him, refusing to let him rest, reminding him that the land itself resisted his claim. Each movement, each maneuver, was not only a step of war, but a gesture of rivalry between two men who had become symbols to their worlds. For the soldiers who followed, the banner was a beacon. They watched it from afar, rising over the press of men, always searching for it in moments of chaos. When arrows fell and screams filled the air, eyes turned upward on, seeking that white and red cloth against the dust. As long as it stood, hope did not falter. When it dipped, when it swayed, hearts clenched with fear. In those moments, Richard himself became more than a king. He became the promise that the struggle had meaning, that they did not bleed in vain. The desert wind carried more than banners. It carried voices, prayers whispered in tents, chants rising from men as they braced for battle, the low murmur of fear and faith mingled together. It carried the scent of sweat, of dust, of iron, and of blood. It wove itself through the lives of men who no longer counted the days, who measured time only by the distance to water, by the toll of fatigue, and by the sight of their king's banner refusing to fall. But for all its power, even the banner could not shield them from the deeper truth of the struggle. The desert showed no mercy, and Saladin's shadow was constant. Richard's men knew that while their king's strength gave them courage, the Sultan's patience threatened to undo them. It was not a matter of who struck harder, but of who could endure longer. The banner in the wind was a promise, but it was also a challenge, daring the desert and its defenders to test the Lionheart's resolve. At night, when fires flickered low and silence spread, men dreamed of that banner. Some saw it in visions, glowing like a star against the dark. Others feared to see it fall, waking in cold dread from the thought of defeat. In their dreams, Richard was always beneath it, sword in hand, his figure unmoved by shadow or flame. For them, the rivalry between kings became a story lived out in banners and visions, a struggle that stretched far beyond the clash of steel. The desert itself seemed to acknowledge the rivalry. The dunes shifted, the wind howled, and yet through it all the banners of both kings held, facing one another across the endless expanse. One of the cross, bold and stark, the other of the crescent, flowing and proud. They did not meet in silence, but in the endless murmuring of the wind, as though the land itself carried the voices of faith and fear, of defiance and patience, of the two greatest leaders of the age. And so the story unfolded, not in a single moment of triumph or defeat, but in the long passage of days, in the endless march of men who found their courage renewed each time the Lionheart's banner caught the desert wind. It was a symbol of defiance, of endurance, and of a king whose very presence turned cloth and colour into a living force. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin lived not only in battle, but in these unseen spaces, where banners moved against the sky and armies carried on because symbols gave them reason to endure. The wind did not tire, the desert did not relent, and neither did the kings. While the banners of the Crusaders whipped sharply in the desert wind, there was another rhythm that carried through the land, quieter, slower, but no less powerful. It was the rhythm of Saladin's patience, a force not born of sudden strikes or bold declarations, but of measured endurance. His way of war was not always in the clamour of sword against shield, but in the long game of attrition, in the turning of time itself into a weapon. Where Richard seemed to blaze like fire, Saladin endured like stone, shaped but never shattered by the currents pressing against him. The Sultan's court and commanders saw this patience woven into every choice he made. He was not quick to rage, nor easily drawn into traps of pride. Instead, he weighed the world before him, as though each decision were a chess piece, carefully moved, never wasted. He did not need to match Richard's boldness with equal force. He needed only to ensure that the Lionheart never found a path to easy victory. In this, patience became his greatest ally, for Saladin understood that the land itself could serve him better than the sword. The desert was a companion to Saladin, familiar and unyielding in ways the Crusaders could never fully tame. He knew its wells, its hidden passes, its seasons of plenty, and its seasons of hunger. He knew when the winds would rise, when the sun would sap the strength of even the hardiest men, when the rains would turn roads into mire. To his soldiers, he was not only a leader, but a guide through the very landscape. His knowledge was protection, his foresight survival. Against this, the Crusaders moved like strangers, always one step from ruin should they lose the steady hand of their king. Saladin's patience was not passivity. It was the watchful eye of a hawk circling high above, conserving its strength until the moment came to strike. He would harass when needed, testing the edges of Richard's line, sending swift riders to strike at supply trains, disappearing before a counterblow could land. He would appear at a distance, banners glinting in the sun, then fade back into the folds of the horizon, leaving the Crusaders weary with uncertainty. He allowed frustration to grow in his enemies, allowed doubt to creep into their ranks, for he knew that time itself would erode what steel alone could not. This patience was not born of weakness but of faith, a faith that reminded his men that their struggle was not only for land but for belief, not only for cities but for the honour of their world. Saladin prayed often, grounding his strength in the certainty that what he fought for was greater than himself. This belief steadied him when others might have rushed blindly at the sight of Richard's banner. It kept his hand firm when temptation whispered that a single daring strike might end the war. Saladin understood that a king's impatience could undo even the mightiest host, and so he waited, steady as the desert itself. His men mirrored this patience, though not always easily. They too felt the heat, the hunger, the endless march. They too longed for swift victory. Yet when they saw their sultan, calm and composed, they found themselves steadied. He spoke to them not in fiery bursts, but in steady words, reminding them that their endurance was itself a weapon, that every day the enemy remained beneath the sun was a day that weakened them further. Saladin's calm became their anchor, his composure their shield against despair. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin then was more than swords and sieges. It was a contest between fire and stone, between the sudden force of the Lionheart and the steady endurance of the Sultan. Where Richard inspired with visible presence, Saladin commanded with quiet certainty. Where one led by charging into the fray, the other led by knowing when not to move at all. Each man, in his own way, embodied strength, and together they created a balance that neither could easily break. In moments when the two armies faced one another across the plains, the difference was clear. The Crusaders surged forward with the energy of men carried by their king's unshakable defiance. Saladin's lines, by contrast, held like a tide, bending but never breaking, absorbing the force without crumbling. His cavalry rode like the wind, striking suddenly then vanishing, teaching the Crusaders that the desert belonged to those who knew its secrets. The rivalry was played out not only in battles but in silences, in the long stretches of waiting where each side measured the other, wondering who would yield first. Saladin's patience was not without cost. He bore the strain of holding so many under his command, of feeding them, of maintaining the delicate alliances that bound his empire together. Princes, emirs, and tribal leaders all had their own desires, their own rivalries, their own grievances. Saladin's strength lay in his ability to keep them united beneath his banner, to remind them that the struggle before them was larger than their quarrels. He mediated disputes, offered generosity, tempered ambition. It was another form of endurance, one that required as much strength as any battlefield. In private moments, Saladin's patience revealed itself as a kind of weariness too. He was a man, not merely a symbol, and even he felt the press of years, the toll of ceaseless struggle. Yet even in weariness, he did not falter. He accepted the slow pace of the war as part of its nature, as though time itself were a battlefield where he, too, must remain unyielding. His restraint was not a mask, but a discipline, forged through years of conflict and devotion. A discipline that allowed him to meet Richard not in rashness, but in measured resolve. As the desert nights spread wide, cool beneath the stars, his camp became a place of quiet order. Lanterns flickered, prayers rose, and the Sultan walked among his men with the ease of one who shared their burdens. He did not set himself apart, and in that closeness lay much of his strength. Where Richard dazzled with the brilliance of a single figure, Saladin bound his host together with the threads of familiarity, respect, and the steady assurance that their leader was constant. This constancy was itself a weapon. The Crusaders, for all their fire and banners, could not escape the sense that their enemy was always there, just beyond the horizon, waiting, watching. They could not rest easily, knowing that Saladin might strike at a moment's weakness, nor could they goad him into foolish battle. His patience was a net, invisible yet inescapable, closing slowly around them as surely as the desert sun. Thus the rivalry continued, fire against stone, banner against crescent, each testing the other not only in arms but in spirit. Richard's defiance carried his men forward, but Saladin's patience denied him the triumph he sought. It was not a war of sudden victories, but of long endurance. A struggle where the true measure of strength lay not in how quickly one could win, but in how long one could last. And so the desert bore witness to two kings locked in a contest greater than themselves, one blazing like a lion in the wind, the other enduring like the earth beneath their feet. As the long days gave way to darkness, the desert revealed another face of the war. The heat that had pressed on every man by daylight slipped into the cool silence of evening, and across the plains the glow of campfires began to flicker. Each small flame was a fragile island of light in the vastness of shadow, a reminder that beneath the stars the armies of two great kings still lingered, still watching, still waiting. The battlefield, so loud with the shouting and clashing steel when the sun was high, became something quieter after nightfall. Though not truly restful, the hum of voices carried in low tones, the shuffle of armour being set aside, the sound of horses shifting restlessly against their tethers. Fire crackled, casting fleeting shapes against the canvas of tents, and above it all the stars burned cold and distant, as if the heavens themselves were indifferent to the struggles below. For the Crusaders, the night fires were more than warmth. They were a shield against the deep unease of the dark. Men huddled close, speaking of their homes, their fears, and the battles yet to come. Some stared into the flames in silence, lost in thought, while others whispered prayers with hands folded tightly. The fire gave them something to focus on, a fragile certainty that they still belonged to the living, that the world beyond the flame circle had not already swallowed them whole. Richard himself often rode quietly among the fires, the glow catching on his mail and helm. His presence brought steadiness, even in silence. He was no ghostly king who vanished into the safety of distant chambers. He remained among his men, a figure of assurance in the restless dark. Soldiers lifted their eyes as he passed, and though words were seldom exchanged, the mere sight of him strengthened their resolve. His banner, lowered but never hidden, stood by torchlight as a promise that their cause had not faded with the sun. Across the plain, Saladin's camp burned with its own constellation of lights. His fires were fewer, carefully arranged, their positions chosen as much for strategy as for comfort. He understood the way fire carried across the desert night, how a careless blaze could reveal too much to watchful eyes. His camp was ordered, disciplined, its movements softened by caution. Within it, the Sultan moved with quiet composure, listening to his emirs, sharing the evening meal, and walking among his soldiers as calmly as if the war beyond were only a shadow. Between the two camps stretched a sea of darkness, and in that expanse the war lived on in subtler forms. Scouts crept through the night, their footsteps swallowed by the sand, listening for the faintest stir of movement. Arrows sometimes hissed from the dark, finding no certain mark, but reminding men that sleep could not be trusted. The night was a weapon in itself, as unsettling as any sword, and both kings knew it well. For the men, the firelight sharpened contrasts. Within its glow, faces seemed familiar, voices steady, life fragile yet grasped. But just beyond its reach, the unknown pressed close, an unseen world where the enemy might be only a breath away. This tension bound soldiers to their flames, reluctant to stray too far, wary of the silence that surrounded them. Night on the battlefield was never entirely peaceful. It was a balance between watchfulness and weariness, between the desire for rest and the dread of being caught unprepared. The crackle of fire carried stories. Crusaders spoke of Jerusalem, of the promise of holy victory, of the Lionheart's courage. Saladin's soldiers recited verses of the Quran, their voices weaving through the night like steady currents of belief. Each camp found comfort in words that reminded them of purpose, of faith larger than themselves. The war, though fought with weapons, was carried just as deeply in these moments of quiet devotion, when men turned their eyes not to one another, but to something greater in the sky above. Richard often found his strength renewed in such hours. Though he bore the weight of kingship and the strain of endless conflict, the sight of his men gathered by the fire reminded him why the struggle continued. The flames lit their faces with resilience, with weariness that did not yield, with the stubbornness of men far from home who yet refused to falter. In their endurance, he saw the reflection of his own determination. Saladin too found meaning in the fires of night. He did not see his army as faceless masses, but as brothers bound by shared duty. He walked among them, listening, offering words of encouragement, reminding them that their endurance was as powerful as any blade. The night gave him time to be more than a commander. It allowed him to be a shepherd of spirits, guiding his people not only with orders, but with presence. His patience, sharpened by years of struggle, becomes most visible in these hours. Box of the fires on both sides became mirrors of the rivalry itself. Richard's, bright and bold, scattered in abundance, carrying a kind of restless energy even at rest. Saladin's, measured and deliberate, steady points of light that revealed discipline and control. Between them stretched the unlit desert, the uncertain silence, the space where neither side could claim dominion. That space was itself a battlefield, though unseen, a place where fear and imagination did the work of steel. As the night deepened, shadows stretched long, and the fires burned lower. Men dozed uneasily, clutching weapons close, waking at the smallest sound. Horses snorted, armour rattled, the faint murmur of guards echoed across the stillness. Above all, the stars remained, cold, countless, and unmoved by the small struggles below. To men on either side, the heavens seemed to watch with indifference, offering no sign of favour, only the reminder that their rivalry was but a fragment of the world's greater span. And yet, in those hours, something enduring was forged. The rivalry of kings was not only carried in daylight charges or in grand councils, but in the small moments of endurance by the fire. Every soldier who resisted despair through the long night, every watchman who kept his post despite exhaustion, every whispered prayer rising in the dark, added another thread to the great tapestry of the war. These unseen struggles, lit only by fragile flames, were the quiet battles that sustained the louder ones to come. Sometimes, across the distance, a gust of wind would carry scents or sounds from one camp to the other. The faint murmur of voices, the smell of roasting meat, the echo of a distant chant. In those moments, men were reminded that the enemy was not a phantom, but as real as themselves, living, breathing, waiting beyond the veil of shadow. The fires of one camp became a reminder of the fires of the other, and in that strange reflection lay the truth of their shared endurance. The desert night was long, but it was not endless. Slowly, a pale glow would rise on the horizon, softening the stars, turning darkness into the blue of dawn. Fires dwindled into embers, smoke curling upward as the world prepared to return to its harsher light. Men stirred, rubbing weariness from their eyes, adjusting armour once more. Horses were readied, weapons inspected. The rivalry did not rest with the coming of morning, it only shifted shape, from the quiet test of endurance by the fire to the louder struggles that awaited when the sun climbed high again. Yet in those lingering embers lay something the day could not erase, the memory of how men endured the night, of how firelight had held back the weight of shadow. For Richard's Crusaders, it was proof that their king's banner still gave them reason to stand. For Saladin's soldiers, it was proof that their sultan's patience had kept them steady through silence and fear. The rivalry was alive in the smallest flame, as much as in the greatest charge. Thus the battlefield by night told its own story, quieter, but no less vital. The fire's glow revealed not only the faces of weary men, but the endurance of two kings whose struggles stretched across every hour, whether beneath the burning sun or beneath the cold watch of the stars. The clamour of swords and the cries of men did not last forever. Even on a battlefield where dust and blood had been churned into the earth, silence always crept back in, soft as a veil settling over the land. What survived after the clash was often stranger than the combat itself. The pause, the stillness, the fragile sense that something more was about to unfold. In that fragile quiet, Richard and Saladin, two men who had not yet crossed swords directly, yet whose names were bound together like opposing stars, began to acknowledge each other not only as adversaries, but as voices that needed to be heard. It is easy to imagine their rivalry as a constant storm, unyielding and merciless. Yet history is rarely so simple. Within the long campaigns of the Crusades, there were intervals when bloodshed halted, when men turned to words instead of steel. These intervals did not come from mercy alone, nor from weakness, but from a shared understanding that endurance could not last without pauses. Armies needed to heal, supplies had to be gathered, and leaders had to think beyond the moment's fury. In such moments, Richard and Saladin allowed words to carry weight equal to swords. The world of the 12th century was one in which kings and sultans often spoke through envoys. Rarely did they stand face to face unless compelled by circumstance, yet their presence could be felt across distance. A message carried under the desert sun might be as sharp as a spear, or as gentle as an outstretched hand, depending on the tone in which it was delivered. For Richard, whose reputation as the Lionheart had spread from Europe to the Levant, his words carried the force of command. For Saladin, whose very name had become synonymous with steadfastness and faith, his words were like the measured flow of water, calm yet relentless, shaping the very course of events. At night, as camps were lit by countless fires, these words began their journeys. Imagine an envoy riding from one encampment to another, his path illuminated by the faint shimmer of stars overhead, the desert winds whispering along his cloak. Such men bore not only scrolls and seals, but the fragile balance of honour. A single word misspoken could sour a delicate negotiation. A phrase carefully chosen could alter the course of the war. Richard, though famed for his ferocity in battle, was not without a sense of respect for his opponents. He recognised in Saladin an adversary who fought not with treachery, but with strategy and conviction. When he dictated messages, his tone often carried both firmness and dignity. He could be unyielding in demands, such as access to Jerusalem or safe passage for pilgrims, yet he tempered those demands with a recognition of Saladin's stature. In turn, Saladin, though he had risen to power through both wisdom and war, did not dismiss Richard as a reckless invader. He knew him as a king who inspired loyalty, a man whose courage was undeniable, and perhaps most importantly, as someone who could not easily be broken. Thus, the words exchanged between them became a different kind of battlefield. They were negotiations not only of land and fortresses, but of honour, of how each man would be remembered. One can almost hear the quiet rhythm of a scribe's pen as he recorded dictation late into the night, the flicker of a lamp casting shadows across parchment, while a ruler's voice shaped phrases that would travel through guarded lines to his enemy. The substance of these exchanges often circled around the holy city of Jerusalem. For Richard, its capture was the very heart of the crusading mission, the jewel that justified the suffering of his men and the fortunes spent to cross the sea. For Saladin, Jerusalem was not merely a city of stone and walls, but the sanctuary of faith, the spiritual pulse of his world. To concede it was unthinkable. To lose it once more after having reclaimed it would wound not just his reign, but his people's trust in the justice of God. Here lay the paradox. Both men knew that possession of the city was as much a symbol as it was a strategic prize. Words passed between them like arrows that could never quite pierce the other's armour. Yet not all was rigid defiance. Beneath the iron edges of their positions, glimpses of humanity emerged. Richard fell ill during the campaign, his strength faltering under the strain of endless marches and battles. In this moment of weakness, Saladin, hearing of his rival's condition, did not strike with cruelty, but instead sent fruits and cooling snow from the mountains to ease the fever. It was a gesture that spoke louder than armies. To send aid to an enemy was to acknowledge a bond of respect deeper than hatred. It did not erase the rivalry, but it transformed it into something more enduring. A contest not only of power, but of magnanimity. The envoys who carried such gifts must have felt the strangeness of their task. To approach the Lionheart's camp with tokens from the Sultan was to step into a space where enemies and benefactors blurred. Perhaps the men of Richard's household, hardened knights with the dust of countless marches upon them, paused to reflect as they placed fruit before their king, fruit that had passed from the hand of Saladin himself. Perhaps Richard, weary in body but sharp in mind, understood at that moment that his opponent was not merely a foe to be crushed, but a man who embodied an ideal of honour not unlike his own. From these acts and words, a peculiar rhythm emerged in the rivalry. By day, swords clashed, cities trembled, and strategies unfolded like great games of chance upon the desert sands. By night, letters crossed the lines, bearing phrases of courtesy, questions of terms, hints of truces that might never hold. It was as if the war itself breathed in and out, inhale of fury, exhale of diplomacy. Neither Richard nor Saladin could wholly bend the other, yet neither wished to descend into dishonour by refusing dialogue. And so, when we think of these words between enemies, we see not just parchment and ink, but the faint glow of possibility. Each message was a thread, delicate yet strong, woven into the larger tapestry of the Crusades. If war was inevitable, so too was the need to recognise the humanity of one's rival. Richard may have seen Saladin as the shadow against which his glory would shine brightest, but he also saw in him a man who stood tall enough to make that glory meaningful. Saladin, for his part, may have viewed Richard as a relentless intruder, yet he also saw a ruler whose courage elevated the very struggle into legend. Night after night, the fires on both sides of the battlefield cast their light upward, as if reflecting the words spoken and written below. Somewhere, beyond the clash of weapons, beyond the ambitions of kings and the prayers of multitudes, there lingered a sense that history itself was listening. The rivalry of Richard and Saladin would not end in the silence of one man's defeat, but in the murmur of conversations that spanned battlefields. Their words, no less than their swords, carved a legacy into the chronicles of time. and so the desert wind carried whispers, messages penned in careful script, greetings sent between camps, questions of peace entwined with promises of war. Words between enemies, yes, but words that revealed the strange and solemn truth of history, that even in the fiercest rivalries, respect could endure, and that sometimes the quietest exchanges echoed longest across the centuries. The war between Richard and Saladin unfolded not only on battlefields of dust and stone, but also along the long, weary roads that stretched across the Holy Land. These roads bore the footprints of thousands who were neither kings nor commanders. They were the quiet arteries of the crusade, carrying not just armies, but the fragile burdens of faith, fear, and endurance. Soldiers marched with iron at their sides, but pilgrims trudged with only prayers upon their lips. Together they filled the landscape with a ceaseless tide of motion, each step pressing the soil deeper into the story of the age. Imagine the sight. A caravan winding along a dusty path, shields flashing in the sun beside pilgrims draped in rough cloaks. A knight, grim behind his helmet, guiding his horse with weary patience, while a barefoot penitent stumbled close behind, clutching a cross carved from wood. They moved in uneven rhythm, soldiers driven by the call of commanders, pilgrims compelled by the pull of heaven. The road blurred their purposes together, binding them in a strange fellowship of fatigue. Everywhere the eye turned, there were signs of the journey's weight. Water skins sloshed with the last remnants of a day's ration. Packs strained against men's shoulders. The banners of noble houses flapped in the hot wind, their colours bright against the dry earth, while the rough symbols of pilgrims, crudely drawn crosses stitched to tunics, seemed faded by sun and sweat. Dust clung to all alike. The distinction between warrior and wanderer grew dim beneath the sameness of exhaustion. Richard's men moved with the rigid order of soldiers, lines held together even under the harsh glare of the sun. The king himself often pressed forward with a vigour that astonished his followers, his lion banner waving above a column of armoured knights. The clang of metal boots, the creak of leather straps, and the steady thump of hooves created a rhythm that matched the unyielding pace of their leader. For these men, each step forward was a step toward the promise of glory or salvation. But around them flowed another current, pilgrims who had journeyed across seas and continents, not to fight, but to see with their own eyes the sacred soil of Jerusalem. They came from distant villages and great cities, their tongues carrying the accents of lands as far apart as England and the Rhineland, Italy and the Low Countries. They brought with them stories of shrines at home, relics kissed by generations, and the belief that a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was the highest form of devotion. Some carried their lives upon their backs, small bundles of bread and keepsakes. Others leaned on walking staffs worn smooth by months of travel. Their steps faltered often, but still they pressed on. To Saladin's men, watching from afar, these roads were not merely paths for invaders. They were channels through which the fervour of distant Christendom flowed, unending, relentless. Yet the Sultan also knew that for every soldier armed with steel, there were pilgrims unarmed, driven by faith rather than conquest. His scouts reported these strange gatherings, women with veils drawn against the dust, elderly men staggering behind columns of knights, children clinging to their parents as they shuffled along. For Saladin, the sight was a reminder of how deeply the struggle for the Holy Land had entangled itself with the souls of countless people. Along the way, the landscape itself bore silent witness. Olive groves bent under the heat, fields long abandoned by villagers lay barren, and wells became lifelines where pilgrims crowded desperately for water beside hardened warriors. Small chapels, once tended by monks, now stood as way stations, offering shade and quiet prayer to those passing through. These places became momentary sanctuaries where knights and pilgrims alike knelt side by side, their whispered words rising together into the air, indistinguishable in intent, if not in tone. Disease travelled these roads as faithfully as devotion. The dust carried fevers, the heat wore down bodies, and the mingling of so many souls spread sickness like wildfire. A knight who had survived the clash of lances could fall to a fever contracted at a crowded well. A pilgrim who had crossed mountains might collapse before ever reaching the gates of a holy city. The roads were littered, not only with footsteps, but with graves, small mounds of stone marking where the journey had ended. Yet even these silent markers became part of the pilgrimage, reminders to those still walking that faith demanded endurance even unto death. Richard, though king, could not close his eyes to the sight of these pilgrims. Reports reached him daily of their hardships, of how they trudged in the wake of his army, sharing the same thirst, the same burning winds, the same fear of ambush. For all his reputation as a warrior, he recognized that these men and women were threads in the same fabric as his soldiers. Their presence deepened the weight of the crusade, reminding him that the war was not his alone, nor his knights alone, but bound to the hopes of countless souls who had crossed oceans simply to walk these paths. Saladin, too, felt the echo of their footsteps. To him, they were evidence of how far the allure of Jerusalem reached, how the city had become a beacon pulling hearts across continents. Yet he also knew that pilgrims could complicate war. For every night he fought, there were innocents whose presence lent a strange shape to the conflict. He could not dismiss them, nor ignore the reality that they too believed themselves part of God's design. In this, he faced the delicate balance of being both warrior and protector, mindful of how his actions would echo in the judgment of his people and his faith. Nights along these roads were filled with firelight. Soldiers gathered around crackling flames, their armour piled beside them as they shared meagre meals. Pilgrims huddled nearby, their conversation soft, their prayers whispered into the darkness. The stars above were sharp and clear, stretching endlessly over the desert. Under that vast sky, differences between knight and penitent seemed to dissolve. All were travellers, all were vulnerable, all were moving toward a city that held the weight of eternity in its stones. From time to time, stories drifted through the camps. A pilgrim would speak of visions seen in dreams, of saints guiding footsteps, of miracles witnessed on the road. Soldiers, hardened by battle, would listen in silence, perhaps dismissive, perhaps secretly comforted by the thought that even their suffering might hold divine purpose. The roads became a tapestry of tales, woven together by voices in many languages, each carrying fragments of hope and dread. And always, the rivalry of Richard and Saladin loomed above these journeys. Their decisions shaped the very conditions of the roads. A truce declared meant safer passage for pilgrims. A battle lost meant new dangers for the unwary. The presence of both leaders hovered over the travellers like unseen guardians or predators depending on the day. Yet the pilgrims themselves, trudging step by step, often seemed beyond fear of kings and sultans. Their eyes were fixed upon the horizon, upon Jerusalem, and upon the promise that their suffering was not in vain. As the roads wound onward, a strange unity emerged. Soldiers who might once have dismissed the pilgrims as burdens began to see in them a reflection of their own endurance. Pilgrims, who had looked to knights as protectors, began to understand that these warriors carried wounds of spirit as heavy as any pilgrim's aching feet. Between them stretched an unspoken bond, forged not by vows of fealty or declarations of faith, but by the shared dust of the road. Thus the Holy Land did not belong only to Richard and Saladin, nor even to their armies. It belonged to the countless footsteps pressed into its soil, to the unending tide of pilgrims and soldiers who filled its paths with hope and suffering. Their journey, slow and unremarkable to the world's chronicles, gave the crusade its true scale. For while kings plotted and commanders marched, the roads told another story, of endurance, of devotion, and of the ceaseless movement of souls drawn to the promise of a holy city. And so, as the sun set upon endless lines of weary figures, and as banners cast long shadows across the fields, the rivalry of king and sultan was carried forward not only in battle, but in the quiet persistence of those who walked the same roads, bound by faith and fate, toward a destiny greater than themselves. The land stretched on with an unrelenting vastness, as though each horizon simply unfolded into another, never bringing the destination closer, only deepening the journey. The holy city lay ahead in every thought and prayer, yet it remained elusive, veiled behind distance, hardship, and time. For armies and pilgrims alike, the march became a kind of endless ritual, footsteps pressing into the earth, breaths carried by the dry wind, eyes fixed on the pale line where earth met sky. The march was long, not simply because of distance, but because of the weight carried in every step. To walk toward Jerusalem was to bear a burden that stretched beyond the body. Knights carried the expectations of kings and lords, of oaths sworn upon crosses and relics. Pilgrims bore the quiet hope of redemption, each step believed to bring them closer to salvation. Soldiers, hardened by battles, trudged onward, knowing that ahead lay not only the possibility of triumph, but also the certainty of further blood. The land absorbed all these weights, turning the march into something larger than the sum of its travellers. The days unfolded in slow rhythm. Dawn revealed a pale light creeping over the desert hills, touching the helmets of soldiers and the bent backs of pilgrims alike. The morning began with movement, always movement, columns of knights forming lines, peasants adjusting their bundles, horses stamping against the sand. By midday, the sun ruled the sky with a merciless authority, driving men and women into silence as they conserved their strength against its heat. By evening, the fires would flicker along the road once more, small constellations of human persistence scattered beneath the vast heavens. The landscape itself became a companion on the march. Hills rose like waves frozen in stone, valleys stretched out dry and silent, and rivers appeared only as memories told in stories round the campfire. Wells became treasures, shaded groves near monasteries felt like blessings, and the rare sight of green fields brought murmurs of relief. Yet the land was not only harsh, it was watchful. Villages lay abandoned, their walls cracked and silent. Fields that once bore grain now bore only weeds. Every ruin was a reminder of wars that had passed through long before Richard and Saladin, wars that had already scarred this soil. Among the marchers, silence often spoke more than words. Soldiers did not waste breath on chatter when the heat pressed heavily upon them. Pilgrims whispered prayers, but even these seemed swallowed by the immensity of the road. The clink of chainmail, the groan of wagon wheels, and the shuffle of countless feet became the music of the journey. At times it felt as though the march itself was alive, a great, lumbering creature inching across the land, its pulse steady, its purpose unyielding. Richard's presence gave the march a certain relentless character. He was not a king content to ride always at the rear, shielded from the elements. He pressed forward with his men, his banner of the lion lifting above the weary columns. His golden hair, glinting beneath his helmet, earned him admiration even among those too tired to speak it. For Richard, the march was more than a path to Jerusalem. It was a declaration of his resolve, proof that he could endure what his men endured, that he was not a distant monarch, but the embodiment of their collective determination. Yet determination was not enough to shield the marchers from the endless trials of the road. Hunger gnawed at many. Supplies, no matter how carefully rationed, dwindled faster than expected. Bread grew stale, wine soured, and salted meat became both a necessity and a burden. Water was more precious than gold. Knights and pilgrims alike bent their heads at every stream or well, grateful for the chance to drink, fearful of what would happen if the next oasis lay too far away. The long march also carried dangers beyond thirst and hunger. Shadows moved at its edges, raiders, scouts, and the unseen presence of Saladin's watchful eyes. The Sultan did not waste his strength in reckless charges. Instead, he let the march itself wear down his enemy, sending horsemen to harass the flanks, to seize stragglers, to burn supplies. Each attack was swift, vanishing as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a trail of unease. The marchers learned to keep their eyes always scanning the ridges, to listen for the sudden thunder of hooves. The road, already heavy, grew heavier under the constant awareness that danger could emerge at any moment. And yet, in the midst of such hardship, the march carried with it moments of unexpected humanity. Pilgrims and soldiers shared bread at the evening fires, their distinctions blurred by hunger. A knight might lift a weary child onto his horse for a few miles, sparing the small feet from the cruelty of the stones. Songs, though rare, would sometimes rise in the night, voices blending into a fragile harmony that drifted beneath the stars. Even Richard, fierce in battle, could be seen listening quietly when a pilgrim sang a hymn of his homeland. His stern features softened for a brief moment by the memory of simpler times. Saladin's shadow stretched long over this march, though his figure remained unseen. His men knew the land, its turns and valleys, its wells and hiding places. They allowed the Crusaders no comfort, striking where the march seemed weakest, then fading into the desert like smoke. Saladin's patience was a weapon, just as sharp as any blade. He understood that each mile of road was its own battle, each hardship a chance to weaken the resolve of his enemy. He was not only a general of armies, but a master of time, willing to let the land itself serve as his ally. As weeks turned into months, the march became less a journey and more a way of life. For those within its endless movement, the memory of home grew faint. Castles and villages of Europe seemed like distant dreams, blurred by dust and distance. The Holy City was no longer a place upon a map, but a vision that sustained weary bodies. Each step pressed deeper into this vision, as though Jerusalem were not only a destination, but a presence walking alongside them, unseen but always felt. The children of the march were the most striking reminder of this strange persistence. They played beside wagons, their laughter rising above the groans of weary adults. They chased each other among the tents at night, their games carved from whatever scraps of wood or cloth could be spared. In their joy, there was no sense of the march's weight, no awareness of kings or sultans. They moved as though the world were simple, as though the Holy Land were nothing more than the ground beneath their feet and the stars above their heads. The elderly, by contrast, revealed the cost of each mile. Many had set out with fervent hearts, convinced they would see Jerusalem before death. Now their bodies betrayed them, slowed by age, weakened by hunger. Some collapsed along the road, unable to rise again. Small groups would stop long enough to bury them, stacking stones in quiet reverence, then move on before the army left them behind. Each grave became a marker not only of loss, but of devotion, proof that the road to the Holy City was lined with sacrifices unrecorded by history's chronicles. Through all this, Richard remained the driving force of the march. His reputation as the Lionheart was not forged in one sudden act of courage, but in his unyielding presence along the road. His men looked to him as proof that endurance was possible, that their king carried the same thirst, the same fatigue, the same sun upon his back. For them, this long march was not just toward Jerusalem, but toward the embodiment of their leader's will. For Saladin, each report from his scouts deepened his resolve. He heard of Richard's persistence, of the pilgrims who refused to falter, of the children who laughed even in the dust. These accounts reminded him that this was no ordinary enemy. He was not fighting merely a king, but a vision carried in the hearts of thousands. It was a vision that marched onward, step after step, refusing to die. Saladin's patience grew sharper, his calculations more precise, for he knew that when the clash came, it would not be against exhausted bodies alone, but against the spirit that had been tempered on the road itself. The march stretched onward, day after day, each footfall pressing deeper into the soil of a land already burdened with centuries of longing. Jerusalem lay ahead, unseen, but ever present in the minds of those who trudged forward. Its stones seemed to call to them through the distance, pulling them with invisible cords of faith and history. The road was long, but it was not endless. And so they walked, soldiers with lances, pilgrims with staffs, children with laughter, elders with failing strength, all bound together in a single procession. A human river flowing steadily toward the city that held the weight of heaven and earth. The banners that once rippled with challenge now hung heavier, weighed not only by the desert dust, but by the exhaustion of years of conflict. The air no longer crackled with the same urgent fever of battle, though the scars of war were etched deeply into every field, every wall, every face that had lived through this struggle. Both armies had marched, clashed, retreated, and endured, but the land itself seemed to whisper that the time for endless fighting had reached its limit. Richard, whose presence had always been marked by energy and thunder, found himself confronted with the same truth that Saladin had long understood. No sword, however sharp, could endlessly carve through stone without dulling. Even a lion, fierce and unyielding, must pause to breathe. His soldiers were weary, their strength drained not by a single defeat, but by the slow erosion of endless campaigns beneath an unrelenting sun. Saladin, though standing on the soil of his faith and homeland, recognized the same truth from the other side. He had defended, countered, and endured, but even his strength was not inexhaustible. For every new levy of troops called forth, there were fields left untilled, families left without fathers, caravans disrupted, and a land straining beneath the weight of constant readiness. His was a duty not only to resist invaders, but also to preserve the lives of those entrusted to his care. It was within this fragile moment, where exhaustion pressed heavier than ambition, that whispers of truce began to drift between camps. Not as proclamations shouted from ramparts, but as murmurs carried in the quiet exchanges of envoys, in the measured steps of negotiators who knew that words might now serve better than steel. The road to peace was no less treacherous than the road to battle. For Richard, every agreement risked the perception of weakness, and for Saladin, every concession carried the weight of betrayal to those who had shed blood in his cause. Yet both men understood that the rivalry that had burned so fiercely could not be allowed to consume endlessly. Under the pale canvas of night tents, candles flickered over maps already worn from use. Richard leaned over them, his gauntlets removed, his hands scarred from battle yet steady as he traced the lines of coast and city. He spoke not of glory now, but of terms, access, rights, recognition. His words were clipped, practical, but beneath them ran a current of personal pride that would not allow him to return to his kingdom empty-handed. Saladin, in his own pavilion, sat surrounded not by soldiers, but by scholars, advisors, and men of faith. His words were slower, careful, balancing the expectations of his emirs with the vision of his heart. He too sought a resolution, but one that preserved honour, protected the holy places, and upheld his responsibility as a servant of both people and faith. When envoys crossed between the two camps, the world seemed to pause. Where once riders had galloped with messages of war, now they trod more deliberately, carrying not the threat of swords, but the weight of potential peace. Each parchment, each seal, each phrase was dissected with care, for a single word could shift the balance of honour between Lion and Sultan. The soldiers who watched these movements did so with cautious hope. Around the campfires they whispered not of battle plans, but of home, of vineyards in Aquitaine, of bustling markets in Damascus, of families left waiting across seas and deserts. The very thought of rest seemed as foreign and wondrous as victory once had. It was not an easy process. Distrust lingered, for rivalry so deep cannot be smoothed by a single gesture. Richard demanded access for Christian pilgrims to the sacred city, unwilling to yield the central symbol of his campaign. Saladin held firm that the city must remain under Muslim rule, its sanctity preserved. Yet within these unyielding stances, spaces of compromise slowly took shape. Corridors of faith, guarded rites, a recognition that devotion could be honoured without possession. When at last Richard and Saladin's envoys reached agreement, the air seemed to shift as though the land itself exhaled. No triumphant trumpet sounded, no great banners unfurled in sudden glory. Instead there was a quieter recognition that after so much struggle, the sword would for a time rest in its scabbard. The truce that emerged was fragile, like glass held together by the hope that neither side would press too hard against its surface. Christians would have the right to visit the holy places, to walk the streets of Jerusalem as pilgrims, though not as rulers. The coastal cities would remain under Crusader hands, while the interior would stay in Saladin's realm. It was not the grand conquest Richard had once envisioned, nor the absolute expulsion Saladin might have dreamed, but it was a balance born of necessity. In this balance, both men revealed something beyond rivalry. Richard, though denied the full prize of Jerusalem, showed a measure of pragmatism that belied his fiery legend. He could recognise when the cost outweighed the gain. Saladin, though victorious in holding the city, showed a mercy that matched his reputation, allowing access rather than closing the gates. The soldiers of both sides received the news with mixed emotions. Some felt relief, others frustration, many simple weariness. Yet across the camps there was a gradual quieting. Armour was set aside, wounds were allowed to heal, and for the first time in years, the horizon no longer promised an immediate clash. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin had not dissolved. It lingered like embers still glowing beneath ash. Yet the truce allowed those embers to cool into something else. A respect forged not in friendship, but in recognition. The Lion and the Sultan had tested one another, had pushed to the limits of endurance, and had found that neither could utterly overcome the other. In that stalemate was born an uneasy peace, one that carried within it the echo of their struggle. The roads that had once carried armies now carried pilgrims once more. The sound of marching boots gave way to the quieter shuffle of sandals, the murmured prayers of travellers, the clinking of staffs against smalls. Along those roads, memories of battles lingered, yet so too did the promise of devotion unbroken by war. In the stillness of night, as campfires dwindled and silence stretched, One could imagine the lion beneath his banner, and the sultan beneath his crescent moon, both gazing at the same stars. Each carried the weight of their choices. Each knew that history would speak of their rivalry. Yet in that fragile truce, both allowed the world a moment of calm. It was not an ending carved in triumph, nor one drowned in despair. It was a chapter written in the language of necessity, of faith tempered by reason, of rivalry settling into uneasy respect. The cross and the crescent did not merge, but neither did they shatter one another. They stood side by side, divided yet bound, beneath the same vast and silent sky. And so the story continued, not with the clash of steel, but with the quiet footsteps of those who would carry its memory forward. Pilgrims, chroniclers, wanderers and dreamers, tracing paths once walked by kings and sultans, where rivalry had burned and truce had settled, beneath the shadow of faith and the enduring weight of history. The dust of armies had long since settled. The banners that once snapped in the wind above siege towers and desert encampments had been folded away. Their colours faded, their symbols carried now only in memory. The clash between Richard and Saladin had ended in truces and partings, but the true ending of their rivalry was never written in the blood of battle or the silence of conquest. It lingered instead, drifting into the years that followed, echoing through the voices of those who remembered them, reshaped by those who told their stories, and quietly surviving the deaths of both men. Richard's journey home was not a triumphant return crowned with laurels, but a road marked with exhaustion, danger, and the weight of unfinished purpose. He had not taken Jerusalem, that city whose walls had drawn him across seas and deserts, and though he had won battles that glowed like embers in the songs of his men, his heart remained restless, on foreign soil, in the company of rulers who once feared him. He found himself not as a lion in full roar, but as a hunted man, captured, ransomed, and delayed from returning to the throne that awaited him. When at last he returned, it was not to years of peace, but to fresh quarrels, sieges, and campaigns. His sword was never long at rest. He carried into these struggles the same unyielding courage that had marked him in the East, but his body could not always match the ferocity of his spirit. In a skirmish at a lonely castle wall, an arrow pierced his shoulder. The wound festered, as wounds so often did in those days, and from it came the fever that would carry him toward death. He was still young by the measure of kings, but he had burned his years with such intensity that the flame had consumed itself too soon. Far from him, in the lands of the crescent moon, Saladin too had grown weary. The years of leading armies, of balancing alliances, of shouldering the hopes of an entire faith, had pressed upon him until even his resilience began to wane. When illness came, he met it not with armies or councils, but with a quiet surrender. Unlike many rulers, he left no hoarded treasures, no overflowing coffers to gild his passing. His generosity had drained him of wealth, leaving behind little more than the shroud in which he was buried and the stories that clung to his name. Yet those stories were worth more than gold, for they would endure long after the dust of his grave settled. Both men, so different in life, found themselves bound in death by the same strange truth. Their legacies outlasted their bodies. Their rivalry, unfinished and unresolved, became a thread woven into the fabric of memory, binding not only their names together, but the histories of the worlds they represented. In Europe, Richard became more than a king. He became an ideal. Chroniclers polished the rough edges of his reign until what remained was a figure of dazzling courage, a knight king whose heart was said to beat only for valour. Songs carried his name into the halls of lords and the cottages of peasants. Children learned to recite tales of the lion-hearted monarch who had faced the might of the East and had not flinched. In those stories, the sting of his failures was softened, the complications of his politics ignored. What endured was the roar, not the silence. In the East, Saladin's image grew into something even greater. His mercy became legend, his piety an example for rulers who followed. Preachers spoke of him as a man whose faith had guided him, whose victories were tempered with compassion. He was remembered not as one who destroyed, but as one who preserved. His legacy shaped the way later generations imagined what it meant to be a just ruler, a defender of faith, a man who balanced power with humility. His tomb became a place of quiet reverence, a reminder that greatness does not always lie in wealth or conquest, but in the manner one chooses to wield both. The rivalry they shared did not rest quietly in their graves. It grew, retold across centuries, reshaped by the tongues of poets and the pens of historians. In Europe, Richard and Saladin were painted into stories of chivalry, their duel transformed into a symbol of honour that transcended enmity. In the Muslim world, Saladin and Richard became part of a shared memory, where even the enemy could be respected for his courage. It was a rivalry that, strangely, united as much as it divided, reminding each side of the other's greatness. Travellers and pilgrims carried these stories from land to land. Along the roads that stretched across continents, their names were spoken as though they still lived. Merchants who traded spices and silks told of Richard's bold charges, of Saladin's calm patience. Priests and imams, monks and scholars drew lessons from their struggle, shaping them into parables of bravery, faith, and humility. The rivalry became something more than war. It became a lens through which people understood the meaning of strength and the price of ambition. Time, which so often erases memory, did not sweep them away. Instead, it softened them into legends, reshaped them into figures who seemed to exist on the edge between history and myth. And as generations passed, the world continued to call upon them. Kings and rulers who sought to inspire their people borrowed their names, claiming the spirit of Richard or the justice of Saladin as their own. Yet the truth of those men, their humanity, their flaws and doubts, often faded beneath the weight of the legends they had become. Still, the essence of their rivalry endured. It was not about who had won or who had lost. Neither had truly triumphed, and neither had been crushed. Their contest had ended not with conquest, but with recognition, each acknowledging the strength of the other. That recognition gave their story a timeless quality, for it reflected something beyond the clash of armies. The acknowledgement that even in conflict, respect can be borne, and even in rivalry, dignity can endure. The graves of both men remain, separated by miles, divided by faith, yet joined in the memory of humanity. Richard lies in Europe, far from the desert winds that once carried the sound of his charge. Saladin rests in Damascus, his tomb visited by those who still whisper his name with reverence. Yet though their bodies lie apart, their stories meet in the air, in the minds of those who recall them, in the endless retelling that binds them together, as though they still faced one another across a battlefield. And so their rivalry lingers, not in the clash of swords, but in the stillness of memory. It drifts like a faint melody through the corridors of history, never fading, never fully ending. When one speaks the name of Richard the Lionheart, Saladin's shadow is never far behind. And when one recalls the justice of Saladin, the roar of the lion echoes faintly in the distance. They are bound, not by bloodshed alone, but by the strange immortality that comes when two figures of equal weight meet upon the stage of history. Even now, when centuries have passed and the wars they fought have long since ended, their story carries a quiet reminder that greatness does not always lie in victory, nor is defeat the measure of failure. Sometimes it lies in the simple endurance of memory, in the way two lives can become entwined forever, not because one conquered the other, but because both stood unbroken. Thus the rivalry of Richard and Saladin lingers beyond the grave, not in anger, not in hatred, but in the quiet way their names continue to rise together, like twin stars in the night sky, each shining not despite the other, but because of it. And so the story drifts to its quiet end. Across deserts and seas, through cities and camps, we have followed a rivalry that was as much about faith as it was about pride, as much about devotion as it was about power. Richard the Lionheart, restless and unyielding, met Saladin, patient and steadfast, on a stage where the stones of Jerusalem seemed to hold the weight of eternity. Their struggle was fierce, but it was also bound by an unexpected thread of respect, a recognition that even in opposition, honour could be found. As we moved through the story, we saw roads crowded with pilgrims and soldiers, armies marching beneath sun and moon, truces signed in uneasy silence, and a rivalry that lingered even beyond the grave. The clash of the cross and the crescent was not only written in battles, but in the spaces between them, in gestures of mercy, in words of diplomacy, and in the quiet endurance of those who walked behind the banners of kings. It leaves us with questions worth carrying into sleep. What does it mean to fight for faith? And what is left when the fighting ends? How do rivalries shape the memory of entire ages? And why do the echoes of two men still linger across centuries of dust and silence? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments, what stayed with you most in this journey? Was it Richard's fiery resolve, or Saladin's calm patience? Was it the battles, or the fragile truces that followed them? If tonight's story helped you drift a little closer to rest, remember to subscribe before you go. There are many more quiet journeys through history waiting for us, each one a gentle path into the past and into sleep. Good night, and thank you for keeping the lanterns of memory burning softly across the world.